Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a changing America. I'm Johnny Coker. The U.S. is indeed in a transitional period. In January, the U.S. will have a new presidential administration, and at the state level here in New Mexico, there will be a 60-day legislative session where there will be plenty of debate on how to best solve the issues facing our state. Joining me in studio to talk about all of this is Sylvia Ulloa, the new executive director of NM CAFé. Sylvia, thanks so much for being in studio with us today.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So for folks that aren't familiar with the work of NM CAFé, can you just give an overview of what your organization does?
Yeah, so NM CAFé has been in southern New Mexico since 2017, I believe. We're a community organizing group, so we're not a direct service organization. What we really do is try to empower the people of New Mexico, like give them the training, give them the tools that they need to make their own communities better. And so some of the work that we've done here, we were really instrumental in increasing the minimum wage here in Las Cruces to $12 an hour. We were some of the first people in the state to do that, and then we went on to participate in a statewide increase in the minimum wage. So we've done work in responding to immigration enforcement. We've done just a lot of things that, like, even as simple as how do we increase infrastructure to the colonias in southern Doña Ana County. So a lot of different things, and we're really led by the leaders and the organizers that we work with. So this is really like a grassroots organizing or agency.
And I definitely want to get into some of the topics you just mentioned, but before we do that, can you tell me a little bit about your own experience? What led you to taking this leadership role? And how have your previous experiences, like your work with Senator Heinrich's office and as a journalist yourself for many years, how has that work led you to where you are now, and how is it informing the work that you're doing at NM CAFé?
Yeah, I sort of have been feeling, and I've shared this with my colleagues, that like most of my life has been leading me to CAFé. I spent almost my entire career in journalism, and so mostly newspapers, but editing, reporting, doing, and so that was like my thing. And the thing that we do as journalists, and you will get this reference, but it's like to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so that is really about like how do we shine a light on the problems that we have in our communities. And it's a very standoffish thing, right? So we kind of keep it at a remove. And so, you know, don't directly get involved in politics or get involved in policy, but really just talking about what the problems are. And that was really great. I enjoyed it. I loved it. I think it's important to our democracy to create accountability for lawmakers and for communities. But then I moved into, like after a very long career, I moved into the office. I became a field representative for Senator Heinrich here in Las Cruces. And this was the first time where I was like, oh, I actually have to do something about these problems that I was pointing out. And so that was a really instructive thing where we were really working with organizations like CAFé. I worked directly with CAFé one thing that was interesting is I started out as the editor of the Las Cruces Sun News here. And I was, this young organizer named Sarah Silva came to our offices and was talking about minimum wage. And then I worked as a reporter for NM In Depth, and I was interviewing some of their leaders about immigration and the work that they were doing in that space. And then I transitioned to the office of Senator Heinrich, and I was working with them on immigration issues. And so I've really had a long, like these tangential connections to CAFé, that when I found out that this executive director position was open, I was like, oh, I guess I should apply for this. And so in the office of Heinrich, you're really working with a bunch of different organizations, and like CAFé, like Somos un Pueblo, and just different community groups here in Las Cruces. But now this new transition is really very direct, working with people. And so I sort of feel like there was an evolution there, and I think it just is, it's going to be helpful for the work that we're doing here.
And as the new executive director, you came in September, correct? What are some of the key issues that you would like to see NM CAFé really zoom in on, especially in light of the recent general election and the new executive administration coming in January?
So yeah, the elections really created a complete shift in the work that we are going to do and need to do. I think that there was definitely a feeling that like we could work on all of these different issues that we think are important, like lifting up workers, ensuring that immigrant families are taken care of, and a lot of that is like and fighting back a lot against a lot of the culture wars, and so the nature of that fight has changed, right? It's a lot more urgent. We're really worried about the targeting of immigrant families. We're worried about the targeting of LGBTQ and particularly trans people. We're looking at the targeting of working people, extracting from them and giving to the wealthy. And so that makes the thing most urgent. But the thing that I think we have to be careful about is just reacting to chaos. And that was the first Trump administration, was here's the daily outrage. And what we need to be thinking about is how do we protect our communities in a way that is strategic and that is moral. And so that's sort of how things change, right? Like we were going to work on a bunch of like pie in the sky stuff, and now we have to really get down and think about, okay, get down to basics, get down to, just thinking about things more strategically.
And just to go off of that a little bit, I mean, how do y'all plan to be more strategic and, like you said, protect communities in our area, especially vulnerable borderland communities, especially in light of mass deportation threats and threats against the LGBTQ community? Like, what are y'all honing in on actually strategically planning in terms of protecting those communities?
Yeah, so we're working with part of the thing that we need to do is just work across different nonprofits, like with ACLU, with Immigrant Law Center, but also thinking about, we're not gonna get a lot done on the federal level, so how do we do good work on the state and the local level? Ensuring that our police agencies aren't working with ICE, ensuring that the state is not sharing information with national immigration enforcement. And those are things that we can do, and those are the things that we should do, right? We're gonna make sure that our communities know what their rights are, whether they need to answer or open the door to ICE officials. How do we respond to workplace raids and ensure that if there's, we live in a state with a lot of mixed status families, right? And so how do we protect folks whose parents might be deported, who are US citizens? And so we just cannot respond to every single thing, but if we take a look at it as a state, because I'm proud to be from New Mexico. New Mexico really cares about people, cares about immigrants, it cares about the LGBT community, and we can really strengthen that impulse that we have, because there was just a lot of division during the election, and they were really separating people from each other. And what we need to do is really find that commonality and the morality that is very strong in New Mexico, and really hold our legislative folks accountable to protect people.
See, and so have you spoken with either city level, county level, or state level representatives or officials in terms of the future of what to expect, and maybe even if the state or city will comply with those federal authorities in terms of mass deportations or similar threats by the federal government. Have you had these conversations with officials?
Yeah, and I think that most of our officials are going to be pretty supportive. I think that Bill Soules, one of our state senators, is talking about how do we make sure that there's safe spaces for schools, churches, hospitals, where people are not, they won't be afraid to go there if they need medical attention, right? I know that there are folks, Angelica Rubio here in the southern part of the state rep, she's looking at how do we ensure that we're not using state resources to go after immigrants. And so there are definitely champions here, and I feel really confident. Like, there's going to be a lot of people working to make sure that actually passes. And I think that the governor is probably going to be pretty supportive as well.
And what is your reaction to the incoming administration, the incoming Trump administration, hinting at using military assets to carry out plans like mass deportations, especially as someone who's been a journalist and, I'm sure seen the history of this type of action in the past. Just what's your reaction to this?
Yeah, that's so hard to think about because I think it's tragic. I mean, my reaction is that it's horrifying and that it's immoral. And then I have to step back and say, I can't be too reactive to that, right? I have to figure out how we as a community can fight against that. I know that, we're not going to be, Michelle Lujan Grisham is not going to be super open to having him sending troops. I mean, the other thing I would say is that the border is pretty militarized. It's already pretty militarized. And so, that's the thing that we have to be thinking about is how do we fight against that in a more strategic way? Because we can get too reactive, I think. But we're definitely, we're not stepping back from the fight, but we're trying to be strategic and just not, because that's such an emotional thing, right? This idea that, we're gonna send federal troops to do this, that we're gonna put concentration camps in the United States. And that's a real thing, right? Like you can pretty it up and call it what you want, but if you're sending a bunch of people onto military bases in tents and they can't leave, that's a concentration camp. And that is immoral. And so we need to make sure that doesn't happen in New Mexico, period.
I see. And so just over the border in Texas, we have, the Attorney General Paxton coming after, immigrant advocacy nonprofits, and y'all are in New Mexico, but I'm wondering if you've been seeing what's been happening over there, and if y'all are maybe worried about, being targeted by the federal government with the new administration coming in, if, the federal government doesn't necessarily like the type of advocacy work that you're doing. Are those conversations happening between y'all and other nonprofits, and just what are your thoughts on that?
We're absolutely talking about that.
Yeah.
That is a real threat, right? And that's they're coming after journalists too, right? Those are the threats that they're talking about. They're talking about, there was a legislation that sounds really nice about, protecting and guarding against terrorists and stuff.
I think it's called the Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act, which is very loaded. But please, I know y'all have been against that. So can you talk about your own work in terms of advocating against that? Yeah,
and so that was something that was an alert that a lot of nonprofit groups, and including our own national, put out warnings. This can easily be used to target nonprofit groups that are doing immigration work, that are doing any kind of controversial work that might get the ire of the new administration. And unfortunately, our local congressman, went along with it, at least in the first thing. And we were like, this is not acceptable. We had conversations with them, and luckily, and we asked people to call and email and say, this is you need to rethink this. And to his credit, Congressman Vasquez changed his mind on that. The whole rest of the delegation was against that bill, and I think that we have to look for different ways that they are going to use government to go after people that they disagree with or who disagree with them.
And speaking of Congressman Gabe Vasquez, I'm wondering, it does happen that lawmakers do see new information coming in and word from constituents and changing their mind on a particular bill. And in Vasquez's case, it was for this Terror Financing and Tax Penalties Act. Does it give you confidence that he did change his mind on this and that he did respond to his constituents?
No, absolutely. No, I mean, that's the whole process, right?
Right.
It's like he's here to represent us as best as he can, and when we see that we don't agree with that, we voice that concern. Like that's our whole job, and it's his job to like weigh what his constituents are saying and either decide to stick with it or not. But and know that there are consequences to that, right? Like that's okay. Like we're never going to agree with everybody 100%, but we are going to push them.
And something I want to pull back a little bit, talking about your own experience in the field of journalism and working in news for so many years before coming to NM CAFé. I was wondering, I've been hearing a lot about sane washing in the media, and if you have any thoughts on, do you feel like the media is covering politics in a good way right now, or if you feel that too much of a platform is being given to extremists in terms of trying to make their ideas seem like they're on the same level as non-extreme ideas, I guess is the way to put that. Like what's your thoughts on that word, sane washing, making extreme ideas seem not so extreme and giving a platform to folks with extreme ideas?
That's a really complicated question. I think that a lot of times, like I was part of the mainstream media, I think that they inform the public, they do good work. I think that there's something that is sort of like a coherence bias, and it's sort of like if somebody is making these rambling, like, covering Trump is kind of insane, and he doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But it is I'm going to still say it's our job as journalists, and it's not really my job anymore, but like, we have to make a coherent story out of that. And when you make a coherent story out of some rambling thing, to pluck out a few things that make sense, you're sort of, he seems like a normal person. He seems like he makes sense. And so there's a little bit of a, like, it's a little bit hard, right? To say like, this person made a bunch of rambling, incoherent statements for 90 minutes. Right. Because it sounds like you have something against that person, right? And it's difficult. So I putting that out as like a thing that is difficult for the mainstream media to figure out. I will say I don't think that the media has lived up to the moment in many ways, because we have not really done a great job of letting people understand the dangers that we have to our democratic system. And like, the system is not working. We know that the system's not working. That's the reason the election ended the way it did, right? We're not making that clear. But also, we have so much disinformation out there. People are getting their news sources from like TikTok and Discourse and, on their streaming services, like their gaming services. And so they're getting fed a bunch of misinformation from Facebook and all of these things. And like, how do you fix that? I think we've, just living here in Las Cruces, I would say that we've lost a lot of local news, and that's the one area where like it's easy to beat up on the Washington Post and the New York Times, but it's really a little bit harder to do it, on a like the Las Cruces Bulletin and the Sun News and KRWG. Like, they are local people and they know that, and when we shrink that, we have less. We just don't share the same reality, and that is a big problem. We need to be able to like agree on certain like actual facts. And that's a tough thing. And I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, I think you did a good job in answering the question, because it is such a complicated question. And obviously, like, when you refer to the mainstream media, it's like, well, there are so many different media outlets with a lot of different leanings and funding sources, and like you were saying, local journalism is on the decline. It's dying, especially there's news deserts all over New Mexico. And I guess my follow-up question to that is, how do we fix this problem in an industry that's no longer profitable and no longer making money and newsrooms are shrinking, what is the obligation of, is there an obligation of society or of the state to make sure that these entities keep existing in order to, stop misinformation from spreading or straight up disinformation from spreading? Like, do you have any strong thoughts on that?
Well, I think one thing that is promising, because you're right that the news, the funding for news, that model is dead, right? Like printed paper, printed papers and ads in papers, that's just not going to cover a reporter's salary anymore. And so I think one thing that's pretty encouraging about that is just the increase in nonprofit news. We have several in New Mexico, and I encourage people to support them, right? There's Source New Mexico, there's NM in Depth, there's Searchlight, there's KRWG, which I am a monthly supporter of. Those are like El Paso Matters does some of the best immigration coverage in the country. And so and they have a bigger newsroom. The El Paso Matters is a bigger newsroom than the El Paso Times. And so I think that that's one, and I know that there's an effort here in New Mexico to really increase nonprofit local news. And so I think that's really hopeful. But I also have to say that in many ways we have to, I would say just as CAFé, we have to talk directly to people because we might not get, local coverage. We need to be speaking directly, not just, face-to-face conversations, but how do we talk and create content that people can see, what are the issues that are happening in our communities and what we care about. Who are our neighbors, what are their problems, and just speak directly to them. And because that's what a lot of other, right-wing people are doing, right? They're talking straight to people and they're telling them disinformation, and it's on us to create our own conversation with people, because that's the way increasingly, most people are getting their information, right? That's who they're following, who are they influenced by. And so part of what I think a lot of people need to do is just start talking directly and creating these channels directly to people.
Like coming full circle almost in the media, like going from print papers to digitizing, and then now it's straight to just grassroots going up and talking to people. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Absolutely. And we've been having these discussions at CAFé about how do we talk directly to people? How do we get more followers? And it's not when I say it's not a vanity thing, how many followers do we have, but how many people can we influence? How many people can we send out a alert to call Vasquez's office can we get to respond to that, right? So part of it, and I don't think we will never get away from one-to-one conversations with people, directly working with people in our communities, but we also have to be thinking about how are we expanding our influence and our reach directly.
And Sylvia, we don't have a ton of time left on the program, but I did, with the limited time we have, I guess my next question is, I wanted to talk about the legislative session at least a little bit. What are the top priorities that you think should be on state legislators' minds moving into January, into the 60-day session?
This is such a great, the national, we're going to have to put all our focus on the state. And so there are actually really great things happening at the state, and there's a lot of potential. I think one thing that CAFé has been involved in has been pilot projects for guaranteed basic income. And that's something that some of our lawmakers are talking about as something that they want to look into for this year. And we have done a lot of really good work in education, increasing the wages of teachers, increasing the wages of educational assistants, putting more at risk. I can get really wonky about that stuff, but the biggest risk factor for kids, one of the biggest ones, is just being poor, right? Being low income. And if we can make sure that, parents are not one paycheck away from being evicted, if we can make sure that kids go to school fed and we are creating the circumstances for them to succeed. So I think that that's one thing that has a lot of promise and people are talking about it. Let's see. another thing that Representative Rubio has been on since she's been in the legislature is like modernizing our legislature. Our legislature works for rich people because rich people are in there, because they're the only ones who can afford to work for free. And when we say they are working for free, they're working for their own interests. And so we got to make sure that there are middle class families who can bring their experience to the legislature. I mean, that's just it. And when you have an unpaid legislature and paid lobbyists, guess who wins? You know, guess who has the most influence? And so I think that one is another that we have the potential to change. There's like bajillion other things that I think are really good, but those are two that we're thinking about. You know, also, how do we keep working on climate and climate justice, worker justice? Those are all really important things that we'll probably be keeping an eye on.
All right, well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Sylvia Ulloa is the Executive Director of NM CAFé. Thanks so much for coming in today.
It was a pleasure, thank you.
That's all for today's episode. Remember, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker, and we'll see you next time on Fronteras, a Changing America.